Linda?
Yes, so I think now, Joyce, if you have a little bit of an overview of where he was, where I was, and you have any specific questions, please.
Yeah, one of the things that Linda and Ntobeko really wanted was for this to be a dialogue, not only between them, but also with all of you. So if you have questions, please just, identify yourself somehow and speak up, because we don't have mics out there. So if you do have a question, for Linda, Ntobeko, for both of them, please, this is a time to go ahead and ask.
Was Amy aware of the insurgency that was going on? I mean, or was she fairly innocent of this group that was...
Amy was not innocent.
Okay.
Amy had an a degree in international relations from Stanford, and upon her graduation, she actually went to observe the pre-election processes in Namibia, and was really very aware of what was going on in all of Africa. She worked for the National Democratic Institute of International Affairs for a while, and went into communities and set up workshops on voter right. She even worked with Jimmy Carter in Zambia, setting up workshops and things for preparing for elections. So she'd come back and forth from Washington, going back to African countries, but she knew, and she met people from South Africa who kept saying, Amy, this is the time, it's our transition, we want you here, we need to be a part of this. And she often said to people, if something happens to me, I'd rather be a number than a name, because she knew when blacks were killed, which this video actually shows some of their numbers, and she said, I would rather be a number than a name. So she aligned herself with the cause, and her research was really about women's role in the transition. She wrote notes that people have told us have been used in the new constitution in South Africa. She was really not just there running around kind of doing this and that. She had a full sense of understanding of what was going on.
Other questions? Yeah. Yes, Nick said, stand please.
Nick, since I asked you a question and you spoke to my globalization class on Tuesday, for the brief follow-up, I wasn't entirely sure how to phrase that. The question was at the time, if you felt that education was enough to keep people from going down a more hateful path, or if there had to be some sort of breaking point. And the follow-up question to that was, how can you help people to, you can't make people want things, education being one of those, and if someone's already in a hateful frame of mind, how can you help them to look to education to maybe change the way they're doing things?
The question, in case you didn't hear it, was about the role of education and how education can be used to help people go beyond some of their struggles and the issues. Is that a fair restatement?
And how can you help people want to be educated?
How do you help them want to be educated? That's quite the question, Nick.
Yeah.
I think earlier on I said the slogan was liberation before education. That was born out of frustration. But I know for a fact that strategy was not successful. Because most people had flooded the US, the whole of Europe, in university and study. Because if you are in a process of a change, when you are granted the independence, how are you going to govern yourself without education? We have well-educated South Africans currently as we speak, who are sitting in parliament. Some of them, because they're well-educated enough, they know the space is not good enough for them. That's an unfortunate part as well. It's very difficult to make someone, to help someone see something that they don't want to see. But our role is to influence. Our role is to continuously talk about the importance of education. Our role is to engage those who think they are super smart to say, would you imagine if you were to top up your good brains with qualifications, you know. So we have to continuously influence the individuals as well. And again, people totally depend on the spaces that they occupy themselves as well. Was for you as an individual to engage with the importance of education. But when we part ways in a circle that says something that's totally different than what our engagement was, that's not a good space. People need to find the right spaces first.
Well, and we discovered in our research for starting our programs that there were people that education was going to be something other than book education. It's going to learn to weld and to build blocks and to do plumbing. You know, we went to the National Mental Health, the Institute of Mental Health here in the U.S. Met some friends there. We wanted to know what was going to happen to these guys when they got released. We knew that the government would, or that the TRC would give them amnesty because we supported the process, right? So what is going to happen to them? So we actually, in devising our programs, considered the fact that it would be very hard for people to go back to school, to a formal education, which, by the way, is still a privilege in countries like South Africa. People do want to go to school. And sometimes you see much more energy and importance of education in South Africa than here. I always am kind of amazed when I come back and being proud of wearing a school uniform, of being able to buy shoes so you can go to school. So in some of these communities, it's an honor. You know, it's not, it should be a right, and it is a right in the Constitution, but it should be an honor. They look at it that way. But the circumstances, it's like lost generations. And so when you realize that hundreds of thousands of youth were not going to go back to school, in some small way, can we create programs that at least give them skills development where they can have dignity? But most of the parents, no matter what their circumstances, want their kids to go to school. Want their kids to go to school. So I think, I'm not sure about what's happening here in this country sometimes. That, okay, is school important? What does it mean? The whole education thing is interesting, or you're very interested in education, and I'm kind of curious why you're asking the question, but we don't have probably time to go into that. But I think education can take place in many forms. It doesn't necessarily mean a college education, but it means enough education that you have personal dignity and human rights and understand that you are a human being and you should be able to find fulfillment and work in your communities and care for your communities. So whether it's formal education or less formal education, I think we all need to learn. We learn from one another. We continue learning even though you're 72 years old, like I am. Love to learn. And a college like Whittier, being a graduate here, I think prepared me and my husband and whatnot to appreciate education that led you out into your community and that you actually use your education, whatever that education may be. Does that help a little bit? Okay.
Other questions? Yeah.
Senior from Montana. My question is for in living in such a violent and hateful scene at the time, how did you separate yourself from the norm enough to follow what you felt was right?
The question was, to Ntobeko, living in such a violent time, how was he able to separate himself or in fact become part of what was the norm?
Well, it was extremely difficult to step aside from the norm. You become the system. As I've said, violence will only breed violence. We thought we were responding in the right way by fighting back. It actually changed who we were. But that is where we lost our childhood, when we were fighting back fire with fire. You know, so it's extremely difficult to not to retaliate. You know, at times you think there are no options other than to fight back. It depends on what you think mentally. That is what I advocate today. If you think, there's a saying that in every dark cloud there's a silver lining. But if you don't believe in that, you are not going to see that. It goes the same when people say at the end of the tunnel is light. But can you imagine if you're to drive through a dark tunnel? There's no way you'll be able to drive through. It is what you believe in. I did not exist as an individual back then. I had an endocrine that was thoroughly hammered in my brains and my eyes in how I move. It was a belief that was systematically installed in me. I was unable to think and exist as an individual. I was a system. That oath of allegiance that I took, the political classes, that was a follow-up, which was compulsory to attend, and failure to attend results in severe punishment. That was an indoctrination. So my time in prison set me free from that indoctrination. I am able today to say I could have still fought for independence in a number of different ways than we did.
He is very strong and thinks. And he realized, I think, that there was leadership and people were leading, and he was a part of a big movement. As a group, you think differently. But as an individual, I think he found who he was. And that time in prison was very important to Nelson Mandela. 27 years Nelson Mandela was in prison. He went in much more militant. As a militant, came out and realized they had to join forces and cooperate and negotiate to not destroy the country, but to try and make it whole. And so there are people that can do that. There are probably people that can't do that or don't want to do that. But we're hoping that maybe in our story, it gives some people a chance to think about doing that, thinking about a different way of doing things. I think we need to do that in this country right now. I think we need to do it around the world. And if our story can just shed a little light, and I think Ntobeko is an excellent example, to see where he is now, to see where he was then, to me, is somewhat miraculous. We call it a bit of Amy's magic. But we do really learn to respect each other, where we come from, what our needs are, and maybe if we listen to each other, dialogue with each other, we can work together in harmony instead of discord and disharmony. That's a good question. Thank you. High school, right? Yes. Good.
Other questions from the, yes, please.
This is for either of you, I guess. Question would be, how would you describe South Africa post-apartheid, or how would you describe how people's thinking has changed differently after such a difficult period?
The question is, how would they describe South Africa post-apartheid, and how did it move past such a difficult period?
Well, I must say, a number of people will claim the credit for having negotiated, being part of negotiating the process to where we are today. But I doubt without a gift such as the late state president Nelson Mandela, we would have been where we are. He was such a gift, not only to South Africa, but to the global community as well. But I must equally say, South Africa still has a long way to go. 25 years of independence may sound as if it's a lot of years. But in order to balance the actions of the past, it takes a long way. You must remember within that 25 years, it includes learning the ropes. Equally, people count 25 years, but within that 25 years, there's 5 years of government, of national unity, where political parties were learning to coexist within the new South African government setup. Even today, our biggest challenge, it's electricity. We have what we call load shedding. With here, area number 1, for 2 hours, no electricity. 2 hours later, you get electricity. Another area gets shut off. And people are saying, we told you 20 years back, let's invest in solar energy. We will need this nuclear plant system. But no one takes responsibility for refusing to take that advice. today we're sitting with such a crisis. Again, it's becoming a norm because I think Los Angeles, Cape Town, it's the same place. The water crisis that you have, we're experiencing the same thing as well. So again, there's a long way to go. The hope is we have people that are an end product of such, like your colleges and universities, they're a product of US education system. But the unfortunate part of those individuals that when we were fighting for independence, they were being educated. When they come back home, they do not have a room to take their respectful places. Because some of us were not educated, categorized them as people who have no room to be telling us what to do. But deep down, we actually need well-educated individuals to take over and run the government. So again, that on its own, it's a transition that plays itself behind the scenes. And most people do not understand why this country moves forward and backwards. But there are those internal battles that are shaping up. But there is hope because a very great foundation has been laid. And some of those senior generations that led us to independence, that became first government officials, they are finding their way to retirement. And the right individuals are quietly getting to their positions.
Yeah, and you know, I've had the experience of going back and forth for some 20 years now to South Africa and America, South Africa and America. And sometimes I'm over in South Africa and I'm euphoric. I see great change, and I see people that are eating in restaurants or going, you know, there's a beautiful waterfront in Cape Town. And if you watched Blood Diamond, that movie, you see at the very end the woman sitting there under red umbrellas looking at Table Mountain, and you can have your drinks and your coffee, and it's such a civilized kind of environment. Well, that waterfront, when I first went there, when our family first went there, it was mostly tourists. It was white people shopping, white people serving you, and the only black people you saw were in the kitchens or were janitors cleaning. And all of a sudden you go, there's the elections, and there's this euphoria, but you go to the waterfront now and you see the vast diversity. You see tourists, but you see black South Africans, white South Africans, Muslim South Africans, and you see that they're shopping, they're doing things, their jobs and creations, unemployment's still very bad there, but it's a mix of people, and I look at that. Now some other people have asked me, so what do you see different in the townships? Because blacks are still living in black townships. No white people come out there, but blacks can leave the townships if they can economically. And I always say, the difference is you see a lot of the shacks and the poor houses, but you see a dish TV on that house. And it's like, oh, you know, it takes you, okay, what's important? Ntobeko was watching, what were you watching? The tennis, US Open. And he's texting me at night saying, oh, I love watching this. Like, okay. So
the funny part, Joe, I'm unable to go to sleep if any Wimbledon is on US Open. By the time the game ends, it's actually almost, I've got an hour to get ready to go to work and I've not slept. And my wife says, I don't get involved because I don't know why you don't go to sleep and record this US Open. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, so but then there are times that I go out and see nothing has changed. I get depressed. It's a lot of highs and lows going over there. And there's corruption in the government. You know, and I've made friends with, well, you know, and he said, you know, when we were in prison, we were working to free the country. We got out of prison, and we weren't really prepared to govern the country. They didn't think they would even maybe be alive to get out and govern the country. And the ethics of Nelson Mandela said, I will serve one term as president, and he got out. But as you see in many African countries, once people get into power, they stay in power, and they want more power and more power. So there becomes a tyranny again. And I think there's a little of that in South Africa, am I right? And I see that. But again, you talk about education. People were not really educated to govern. And I think that's some of the problems that are happening in South Africa. Power struggles and abilities to govern. And so that's happening now. Because a lot of people, there are great universities in South Africa. A lot of doctors in the United States right now were trained in South Africa. But it's hard to find sometimes good doctors in South Africa because they call it the white flight. But even now, trained blacks are leaving. So, in reverse, I see lots of Americans going over there who are engineers, and they had a nuclear power plant go down, and they were bringing in people from the US and Europe to come fix it. So there's, that imbalance of education and abilities and what they really need to do. And I think that's going to take a time, but leadership is really important, guys. I mean, it is really good. You talk about, you take a leadership class, oh, he's a leader, but is he a good leader? Adolf Hitler was a leader, So the ethics of being a good leader, and what are you leading? And I think right now in our election times, we need to really think about that. It's not just South Africa, really. It's our country, it's the world, and it's about the education that you can get to use your mind, to open up, to listen, to debate on points, not on personality, not on being negative and calling people's names. But we need that true, honest dialogue and debate in this country. Same thing in South Africa.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I had a question for Ntobeko. During your time in prison, where you say you had a chance to reflect on what you had done, how did your way of racial thinking change from viewing white people as the oppressor to shifting to an integrated South Africa?
The question was for Ntobeko, and it was how during his time in prison he was able to shift his thinking about races from one where the whites were the oppressors to accepting a more integrated and equal South Africa.
I must say, it was not an easy thing, but I was able to take the PAC Constitution, compare it with an African National Constitution, and when you do that, it makes you feel like an idiot. Simply because the PAC says Africa for Africans. And when you ask deep what makes one an African, it's not a skin color. That's the response. It says anyone who owes his or her loyalty to Africa is an African. So when you go to the ANC Constitution, it says South Africa belongs to all who works for it. It's a question of choosing Macbeth or Shakespearean English, but the meaning is the same. So it is what we were taught, that the white people are the oppressors, but the very same constitution is totally against the race issues. Race does not exist according to it. So comparing these two, it gave an insight. And secondly, you started to be curious to learn more about white South Africans. Some were saying, I ran away when it was time to be drafted into the army because I did not believe joining the army of the state was justified to go and shoot people. So we were totally ignorant. I must say I was totally ignorant to some of these stories. So when you believe in something, everything starts to fall into its place. These stories, when I was comparing these two constitutions, they started to come out. Even white inmates, when I was engaging them of their background in prison and where they come from, some tell my father was in an army. When he came back, he told them, you are not going to be drafted to the army. But
So we had to go to the army, right? Whites were, and if they didn't go, they were
sent in prison. Some whites were prepared not to run away to foreign countries. They opted to go to prison. All along, those stories were out there, but we were told otherwise. So I was able to put pieces together, and I was able not to reflect on myself as an individual, to reflect on the leadership that I had been respecting. It was the very same leadership was able to say, we're not going to be part of the negotiations. But when the negotiating settlement came up with an elections, the same leadership wanted to take part in the elections. So the question is, how do we embrace a child born out of these negotiations? It was a very simple response from the leadership. All those who did not believe, we were now categorized as individuals who did not want the organization to go to elections. People were executed. That is why earlier on, Linda tried to indicate I was not arrested. That is when I surrendered myself to the police because I was already on the wanted list for years. And I had chosen to go to prison rather than be involved in a black-on-black violence. So again, it goes back to my earlier statement. I value the time I spent in prison because it offered an opportunity to learn more. You know, if I think I'm better than you, which areas that makes me better than you? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? I can't just say I'm going to beat you. So I was able to read more. So if you add all these documents together, they say the same thing. If you go back to history, the PAC is a bad child of the ANC. If you look today, there's Julius Malema, economic freedom fighters. Again, it's coming from the ANC. Because what they advocate is the same thing that's within the ANC, but it's just the approach that is different.
So the internal struggles in those parties created a lot of the racism. But I am always amazed at the generosity of spirit that the black people actually have in their spirit, which Desmond Tutu and others. Have you heard the term Ubuntu? Ubuntu means basically we are, because of others, no man is an island, generosity of spirit, a person is a person through other persons. And the Archbishop Desmond Tutu has always said that the bedrock of the African culture, probably more the tribal cultures, has had that spirit. So when times of trouble, people work together, and it really doesn't matter that who you are or what you do, but we're going to come together in this spirit of Ubuntu. And I think that has helped some of the racial divide in South Africa, but you see the power of the apartheid government separated the people, so they created a lot of fear. So if you go to South Africa, one of the hard things we had to learn about is there were black South Africans, white South Africans, but this mass of group called colored. They refer to colored, and they come from not just mixed marriages, but from some of the tribes, the sort of the Khoisan people that intermarried with the Afrikaans and da-da-da-da-da. So it was very strange. It's very strange to Americans come over. Well, you're colored? What does that mean? If you're not white, then you're black. You know, we put our own picture in this whole thing. You know, and to try and understand that one of the hardest things as a foundation that we've had to do is we have tried to bring our after-school programs to all the communities. Coloreds and blacks do not get along. And yet in this country, they would think that they're colored. I mean, it's just, I still have a hard time wrapping around. But races were divided. You were black, you were at the bottom. You were colored, you moved up, so you had status. Sometimes Asians were considered white, sometimes they were considered, it was crazy to try and understand the racial divide, but it was legal divisions. And I had people tell me, we're going to change races. I said, how do you change races? Well, you go, you petition the government, and you say, I want to be colored instead of white so I can marry somebody. It was a crazy, I still do not understand all the racial issues going on there. But I really think that South Africa, people, almost everyone I've ever met, no matter what color, what background, love their country. There is a spirit, a human spirit, that maybe it is the spirit of Ubuntu, that still is magnetic and miraculously did lead the country, or the country did come out with less violence than anticipated, less bloodshed. And Tutu will say other parts of the world, like Northern Ireland and the Middle East, don't have that spirit, and that was a blessing to South Africa. So it's interesting stuff, actually.
I think we have time for one more question. If anybody has a question. Yes, please.
During the proceedings, CRC proceedings, that your motive was to justify your actions. Nevertheless, when you met the Biehl family, you were confronted with a different way of thinking. So my question is for you, Linda. It seems that the essential part to this is your attitude when you went to South Africa after Amy's death. And as a parent and as an educator, as a mental health professional, I would like to hear from you where that came from in a world with so much hatred and confrontation. And you're the one I feel that stood out to go there, not confrontation.
I was educated partially at Whittier College.
But my question really is,
I know what you're saying, and I honestly think Ntobeko talked about being raised with values. He was proud of his family. He wanted to be Ntobeko Peni, raised and successful and all that, but he was pulled out in circumstances, and when he had to get out of the shoes of a militant, how to become that individual and return to that. And he was able to do that with really no counseling, with very little. I think my values growing up, I look at my grandparents and, they worked hard and they didn't complain. They did their business. They took care. They lost children because they didn't have all these vaccines. I never heard my grandmother complain. She had an aura about her and she enjoyed her life. And my mother would go out and bake for neighbors, and I grew up in a little Republican town outside of Chicago, but the community spirit was help your neighbor. I have some religious background, but I think my education was open to a lot of religion. I think I had a great liberal arts education. My husband and I knew each other, and our values were, from the time we were quite young, our values were very similar. And in reality, I don't think we had a lot of choices because that's kind of who we were. I'm not I like a nice life. I like a nice bathroom. I like a nice bed. I like nice clothes. I'm not some sort of a martyr in all this. I am just a human being that wants the best. I think as a parent, want the best for my kids, proud of my kids. I hope my grandkids have a great life. We all want to somehow live the best we can, but we do have to participate in our world. And if we're living a life of freedom, I'm not sure we're living such a life of freedom anymore. Every time I go to the airport, are we living in freedom here? But it's a value system that I think is a combination. I think the education played. I am a huge advocate of liberal arts education. I'm not educated for any job, believe me. I'm educated to live a life. And I appreciate that. And when I can think about my choices, I have to make, for me, the choices that will take me down my path and that I'm comfortable with and I'm happy with. And I am grateful for the fact that I've had this opportunity. It has made me grow as a person. And I honestly would not have expected 20 years ago ever to be sitting here and just having these chats. But it's an amazing thing, and I have, sometimes I just think Amy gave me a gift, this opportunity.
On that note, I think we should thank Linda and Ntobeko for Linda and Ntobeko have agreed to spend a little time in the lobby, an informal conversation So if you have questions or you just want to say hello. And then we have something for Ntobeko, some Whittier College souvenirs. I should say they're all in a Whittier College bag, and I explain what Fear the Poet means so that when he's going back to South Africa and somebody says, what is this, Fear the Poet? Now, I should also say, when we went to South Africa, and we brought everybody Whittier College pens because we needed things that were small and easy to carry. And they were the good pens. They weren't the cheap pens. They were the good pens. And everybody gave us bottles of wine. So, Ntobeko, this is not a bottle of wine. It is more Fear the Poet memorabilia. Thank you all very much. And again, they'll be in the lobby for a bit if you want to chat with them. Have a good evening.